The letter arrived 3 weeks after her grandfather's funeral, and it changed everything Caroline Hayes thought she knew about her future. It was the spring of 1885 when Caroline stepped down from the dust-choked stagecoach in the town of Silver Bend, Colorado, her traveling dress gray with grime, her gloved hands clutching a leather satchel that held the only two things of value she possessed in the world: a deed to an abandoned silver mine, and a folded map drawn in her grandfather's shaking hand. She had come alone, save for a single trunk strapped to the top of the coach, having sold nearly everything she owned in St. Louis to afford the journey west. She was 24 years old, unmarried, and utterly determined not to let the last piece of her grandfather Silas Hayes slip away into some banker's ledger. Silver Bend was not much to look at. A single rutted street ran the length of the town, lined with false-fronted buildings that leaned as though tired of standing. The San Juan Mountains rose behind the rooftops like a wall of granite and pine, their peaks still capped with the last snows of a long winter, indifferent to the small human struggles unfolding beneath them. Caroline stood on the boardwalk a long moment, breathing air so thin and cold it startled her lungs, and felt for the first time the true distance she had traveled from everything familiar. "You'll be looking for the assay office, I'd wager," said a voice behind her, and she turned to find a heavy-set woman in an apron wiping flour from her hands onto a checkered cloth. Nobody steps off that coach dressed like a Sunday sermon unless they've come about a claim or a husband, and you don't look the type to be chasing a husband. Caroline managed a tired smile. "You would be right on the first count, ma'am. I've come about a claim, my grandfather's mine." The woman's eyebrows lifted with sudden interest. "Hayes, you'd be Silas Hayes's kin then. I heard he'd passed. Good man, if a stubborn one. Ran himself ragged up on that mountain for years chasing a vein nobody else believed in." She extended a hand still dusted white. "Mabel Sutton. I keep the boarding house 2 doors down, and you'll want a bed before you want anything else unless I miss my guess." "I would be grateful for both," Caroline admitted. "A bed and directions to the assay office." "They're one and the same street, honey. Everything in Silver Bend is one and the same street." Mabel laughed, though there was a weariness beneath it, the laugh of a woman who had seen many hopeful faces come off that coach and not nearly so many leave satisfied. "Come on, then. I'll feed you first. A woman can't fight a mountain on an empty stomach." Caroline followed her into the boarding house, grateful beyond words for a stranger's kindness, and it was over a plate of beans and cornbread that she first heard the name that would change the course of her life. "You'll need to speak to Tobias Ford if you mean to go anywhere near that mine," Mabel said, setting down a cup of black coffee. "Nobody else in this territory knows that mountain the way he does. He was your grandfather's partner once, years back before the accident." Caroline's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "Accident? My grandfather never wrote of any accident." Mabel's face folded into something careful, the look of a woman deciding how much truth a stranger could bear on her first day in a hard place. "It was a cave-in back in '78. Killed a man named Dutch Albrecht, buried half the lower tunnel. Silas got out. Tobias got out. Dutch didn't. Folks say Tobias took it hard, blamed himself something terrible, though from what I understood it wasn't any fault of his. He went up into the mountains not long after and hasn't hardly come down since, except to trade furs and buy what few supplies a man needs to live alone. Some in town call him the Mountain Man now, like he's more legend than person. But if you want that mine of your grandfather's opened up safe, he's the only man fool enough, or good enough, to help you do it." Caroline turned the piece of information over in her mind like a coin she wasn't certain was counterfeit. A recluse. A man haunted by guilt. It did not sound like the sort of partner she had hoped to find in this venture, but then, she reminded herself, she had not expected to find any partner at all. She had expected to walk up the mountain, inspect the mine herself, and begin the work of restoring it to profit with whatever local labor she could hire. "Is the mine truly so dangerous?" she asked. Mabel's expression answered before her words did. "Silver Star's been sealed up 7 years, dear. Tunnels rot. Timbers rot. Gas builds up in places a man can't smell until it's already killing him. Water finds its way in and floods what it can. I don't say this to frighten you off, only so you go up there with your eyes open. Your grandfather loved that mountain more than he loved his own comfort, and it cost him plenty. Don't let it cost you more than you can afford to pay. That night, lying in a narrow bed beneath a quilt that smelled of cedar and lye soap, Caroline unfolded her grandfather's letter once more and read it by the light of a single candle, though she had already memorized every line. My dearest Caroline, if you are reading this, then I have gone on ahead of you, and I am sorry for it, for I know how it will grieve you. I leave you the only true inheritance I have to give, which is not money, for I have precious little, but the Silver Star mine, high above Silver Bend in the San Juans. I know it looks a poor gift, a hole in a mountain that has swallowed more of my hope than it ever gave back. But I found something in that last vein before my hands grew too weak to keep digging, something I believe with all my heart will provide for you the life I could never give your mother, God rest her. Do not let anyone tell you it is worthless. Do not let anyone frighten you away from what is rightfully yours. And if you should need help, ask for Tobias Ford. He is the best man I ever knew, whatever guilt he carries that is not his to carry. Trust him, Caroline, as I trusted him. She folded the letter carefully, pressed it against her chest, and closed her eyes against the burn of tears. Whatever waited for her on that mountain, whatever grief or danger, she would not turn back now. She had come too far, and she had promised a dying man's memory that she would not. The morning brought a hard, bright cold, and Caroline set out early with directions from Mabel scrawled on a scrap of paper, a borrowed mule plodding beneath her, its breath fogging in the thin air. The trail wound upward through stands of lodgepole pine and aspen just beginning to bud, and twice she had to stop and let the mule pick its own way around washouts where the spring melt had eaten at the path. By the time she reached the small clearing where Mabel had said Tobias Ford kept his cabin, her hands were numb inside her gloves and her nerve had begun to falter, though she would not have admitted it aloud to any living soul. The cabin itself was sturdy, built of logs notched and fitted with obvious skill, smoke curling from a stone chimney into the pale sky. A row of stretched pelts hung drying along the porch rail, fox and mart, and one great silvered wolf hide that made Caroline's breath catch. Firewood was stacked with a precision that spoke of a mind that valued order, even in solitude. And there, splitting logs beside a chopping block with an axe that rose and fell in easy, powerful arcs, was a man unlike any Caroline had ever seen in the drawing rooms and church socials of St. Louis. He was tall, taller even than she had pictured from Mabel's description, and built with the kind of muscle that came not from vanity but from years of true labor, broad through the shoulders and chest, his forearms roped with sinew as he swung the axe. His hair was dark and worn longer than fashion allowed in the cities, brushing his collar, and a short beard shadowed a jaw that looked as though it had been carved rather than grown. He wore a buckskin shirt open at the throat despite the cold, and when he turned at the sound of the mule's hooves, Caroline found herself looking into eyes the color of a winter sky, sharp and wary and entirely unwelcoming. "You're lost," he said before she had even dismounted. It was not a question. "I am not lost," she replied, gathering what dignity she could manage after a 2-hour ride on a stubborn mule. "I am looking for Tobias Ford." Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. "You found him. Now turn that mule around and go back the way you came, because whatever business you think you have up here, it isn't worth the trouble it'll bring you." Caroline swung down from the mule with more grace than she felt, her boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. "My name is Caroline Hayes. I believe you knew my grandfather," the axe stilled in his hands. For a long moment he only looked at her, and she watched the wariness in his eyes shift into something rower, something that looked almost like pain before he mastered it and buried it away again. "Silas Hayes," he said quietly. "You're his granddaughter." "I am. He left me his mine, Mr. Ford. The Silver Star. I've come to claim it, and I understand you're the man best suited to tell me whether it can be made safe to work again." He set the axe head down into the chopping block with a thud of finality and studied her the way a man studies a storm cloud, gauging how much trouble it intends to cause. "Your grandfather's mine has been sealed for 7 years, Miss Hayes. Sealed for good reason. That mountain took a man's life the last time anybody went digging in it, and I've no interest in helping it take another." "I'm not asking you to dig anything," Caroline said, holding his gaze though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I'm asking you to help me see it, to tell me what's true and what's rumor, and if it can be made safe, to help me make it so. My grandfather trusted you above any other man. He wrote as much in his own hand before he died. I would think that trust might be worth honoring even now." She saw the words land, saw them strike something deep and unguarded in him, and for a moment his mask of gruff refusal slipped entirely, leaving behind a grief so plain it startled her. "You don't know what you're asking," he said low. "Then tell me," she said. "Tell me what happened. I already know a man named Dutch Albrecht died. Mabel Sutton told me as much. But I'd rather hear it from you than from town gossip, if you're willing to give it." He was quiet so long she thought he might simply turn and walk into his cabin and shut the door on her entirely. But at last he gestured toward a pair of rough-hewn chairs on the porch and said only, "Sit. It's a story that deserves more than standing to tell it." She sat, and he lowered himself into the other chair with the careful economy of movement of a man who had learned somewhere that wasted motion could cost a life underground. For a long moment he simply stared out at the pines, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone rough at the edges. "Your grandfather and I worked that claim together going on 5 years. Dutch Albrecht came in as a third partner the last year, good with black powder, better than either of us. We'd found color in the lower drift, not much, but enough to keep chasing. I told your grandfather the timber in that section was rotten clean through, told him twice, but he was so certain the vein was close he wanted 1 more week before we shored it proper. I should have refused to go down until it was done right. I didn't. Dutch and I went in to set a charge, and the roof came down on the return trip. I got Dutch halfway to the entrance before the second fall took him from me. Silas near went in after us both, and I had to drag him back myself, screaming the whole while. He stopped, his jaw working. I buried Dutch on the mountain myself. Told his widow in Denver by letter because I couldn't stand to say it to her face. And I told your grandfather that mine was cursed and I'd never set foot in it again, and I never have." Caroline's throat had tightened with the telling, and she found she could not simply thank him for the honesty, though she wanted to. Instead, she said, "That was not your fault, Mr. Ford. You said yourself you told him the timber needed shoring. Doesn't much matter what I said. A man's dead and I was there and I lived, and he didn't. That's the arithmetic that counts in the end." He looked at her then, and something in his winter sky eyes hardened again into refusal. "I won't take you into that mine, Miss Hayes. I'll not have your death added to the sum of what that mountain's taken from me." "Then I'll go in alone," Caroline said, and she meant it, though the thought terrified her. "I did not come 2,000 miles to be told no by a mountain, or by a mountain man, however kind his reasons. I'll hire men from town if I must. You'll find precious few men in Silver Bend willing to go into a mine that killed a man 7 years back, no matter what wage you offer. Then I will go in myself, with a lantern and my grandfather's map, and I will see what he saw before he died." He rose from his chair so quickly it startled her, and for a moment his sighs seemed to fill the entire porch, all that muscle and quiet violence of the mountains contained in a man who had clearly spent 7 years learning to master it. "You'll get yourself killed inside an hour." "Then help me not to," Caroline said, standing as well, refusing to be cowed by his size or his temper. "Help me make it safe, the way you know how, the way my grandfather trusted you to. I am not asking you to dig for silver, Mr. Ford. I am asking you to help me walk into my own inheritance without dying for the privilege of claiming it." The silence between them stretched long enough that she heard the wind moving through the pines, the distant call of some mountain bird, the impatient shift of the mule's weight behind her. Tobias Ford looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face seemed to war with itself before settling into a kind of weary resolve. "Your grandfather's map," he said finally. "You have it with you." Caroline reached into her satchel with hands that trembled with sudden hope and drew out the folded paper, offering it to him. He took it carefully, as though it might crumble, and unfolded it with the reverence of a man handling something sacred. His eyes moved over the careful lines, the notations in Silas Hayes's cramped handwriting, and something in his expression shifted, sharpened. "He marked a new drift here," Tobias murmured, half to himself, tracing a line with one calloused finger. "East of the main shaft, past where Dutch and I ever went. I never knew he'd pushed this far before he sealed her up." He wrote that he found something in the last vein before his hands grew too weak to keep digging, Caroline said quietly. "He believed it would provide for me. I don't know if he meant silver or something else entirely, but I mean to find out." Tobias looked up from the map, and for the first time since she had arrived, something like genuine curiosity replaced the wariness in his eyes. "Your grandfather was not a man given to exaggeration, Miss Hayes. If he wrote that down, he believed it true." He folded the map again, though he did not immediately hand it back and seemed to be weighing some private calculation. "I'll not promise you silver. I'll not even promise you that mine can be made safe at all. Some tunnels are too far gone, no matter how much timber and sweat a man throws at them. But I owe your grandfather more than I've ever managed to pay back, and if there's a debt I can settle by seeing his granddaughter doesn't die trying to claim what's hers, then I'll settle it." He handed the map back to her, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange, and she felt the calluses there, the strength banked carefully behind deliberate gentleness. "I'll come down to Silver Bend tomorrow and look over the entrance with you. No promises beyond that." "That's more than I dared hope for an hour ago," Caroline said, and meant it. He studied her a moment longer, as though trying to determine what manner of woman had ridden a stubborn mule up his mountain, and refused every reason he'd given her to leave. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Miss Hayes. My grandfather used to say those were often the same thing, viewed from different angles," she replied, and for the first time, she saw the ghost of a smile tug at the corner of Tobias Ford's mouth before he mastered it and turned back toward his woodpile. The following morning, true to his word, Tobias arrived in Silver Bend, astride a rangy gray gelding, a coil of rope, and a satchel of tools slung across his saddle, his rifle riding easy in its scabbard. Caroline had spent a restless night in Mabel's boarding house, going over her grandfather's map by candlelight until the lines were burned into her memory, and she met Tobias on the boardwalk with a determination she hoped masked her nervous excitement. The trail to the Silver Star mine climbed steeply from the edge of town, following an old switchback road cut by miners decades before, now half reclaimed by encroaching brush. Tobias rode ahead, his eyes constantly moving over the terrain in a way that spoke of long habit, reading signs Caroline could not begin to interpret. When they finally reached the mine entrance, a black mouth cut into a granite hillside, sealed with weathered planking that had once borne a warning sign now faded past legibility, Caroline felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. "This is it," she said softly. "This is where he spent so much of his life." Tobias dismounted and approached the entrance with the wary respect of a man greeting an old adversary. He examined the timber framing the opening, running his hands along the beams, testing them with a firm push. "Some of this is sound. Your grandfather reinforced the entrance himself, by the look of it, some time after the accident. He always was careful about what mattered to him." He glanced back at her. "Wait here while I check the first section." "I'd rather see for myself," Caroline said, though her pulse quickened at the thought. "You'll see it, Miss Hayes, once I know it won't collapse on the seeing. Humor me in this, at least." She relented, watching as he pried away the weathered planks, revealing the dark throat of the mine beyond. He lit a carbide lamp he'd brought for the purpose, its flame throwing wavering light against rock walls slick with moisture, and stepped inside with the sure-footed caution of a man who had spent his youth beneath the earth, despite everything it had cost him. Caroline waited outside, counting her own heartbeats, until he reappeared some 20 minutes later, streaked with dust but unharmed. "The main shaft is sounder than I expected," he reported. "Your grandfather shored the first 100 feet well before he sealed it. Beyond that, I can't say without going further, and I'll not go further today without proper timber and more hands than just my own." He looked at her, and something in his expression had shifted, become less guarded, as though the mountain itself had begun to soften whatever wall he'd built around his heart. "If you're serious about this, Miss Hayes, it will take weeks of work. Shoring timber, clearing rockfall, testing for foul air before we go any deeper than your grandfather's last markings. It is not work for the impatient or the faint of nerve." "I have nowhere else I need to be," Caroline said, "and I did not travel 2,000 miles to be impatient now." Something that might have been respect crossed his face. "Then we'd best start hauling timber." The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them had quite anticipated. Each morning, Caroline rode up from Silver Bend, having taken a small room from Mabel Sutton at a rate she could barely afford but refused to abandon. And each morning Tobias met her at the mine entrance with fresh-cut timber, hauled down from stands of lodgepole pine he felled himself, shaping the beams with an axe and adze with a skill that spoke of years of hard-won craft. Caroline, though unaccustomed to such labor, refused to stand idle while he worked, and learned quickly to haul rock, to hold beams steady while he set them, to read the subtle signs of unstable ground he pointed out to her with patient, if gruff, instruction. "You've a stronger back than most society women I've heard tell of," Tobias observed one afternoon, watching her heave a chunk of shattered rock into the growing pile outside the entrance. Her sleeves rolled to her elbows despite the mountain chill. "I was not raised in society, Mr. Ford, whatever my speech might suggest," Caroline replied, pausing to wipe sweat from her brow with the back of one filthy glove. "My grandfather raised me after my mother died, and my father before that, in a house with more books than money. I learned to mend fences and split kindling before I learned to embroider, and I never did learn the embroidering particularly well." He looked at her with new consideration, as though recalibrating some private measurement he had made of her on their first meeting. "Sila's never mentioned you'd been raised so plainly." He was proud in his letters, though he rarely said so outright. He wrote more of the mountain than of me, in truth, in his last years. I think the mine became a way of holding onto hope when everything else had grown thin. She set down the rock she'd been carrying and looked toward the dark mouth of the tunnel. "Do you think he truly found something in there, Mr. Ford? Something worth all this?" Tobias considered the question with the same careful weight he seemed to give everything. "Your grandfather was not a fool, whatever risks he took. If he marked that new drift on his map and believed it worth writing down before he died, I'd not discount it. But mountains keep their secrets close, Miss Hayes. We'll know when we know, and not a moment before." It was during the third week of clearing and shoring that the first true danger revealed itself, and with it, a shift in the fragile understanding growing between them. They had progressed nearly 200 feet into the main shaft, well past where Tobias had first explored, working by the light of carbide lamps that threw long, dancing shadows against walls veined with quartz. Caroline had grown almost accustomed to the mine's cold breath, its ever-present dripping water, when a groan rose from somewhere deep in the rock above them, low and ominous as a dying animal. "Get back," Tobias said sharply, already moving, one powerful arm sweeping around her waist and hauling her bodily toward the entrance even as the ceiling above the section they just left gave way in a roar of collapsing stone and choking dust. Caroline found herself pressed against the solid wall of his chest, his heart pounding as fiercely as her own, his arms locked around her as though he could shield her from the mountain itself through sheer will. When the dust settled and the roaring quiet of aftermath descended, neither of them moved for a long moment. Caroline became abruptly aware of how thoroughly she was wrapped in his embrace, how the heat of him seemed to drive back the mind's chill, how her own hands had fisted in the front of his buckskin shirt without her quite realizing she'd done so. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough, his breath stirring the loose strands of hair that had escaped her braid. "No," she managed. "No, I don't believe so. You moved so quickly." "I've had cause to learn how fast rock can fall," he said, and though his tone remained grim, she felt the tremor in his arms that betrayed just how badly the moment had shaken him, how close old grief had risen at the sound of collapsing stone. Slowly, as though remembering himself, he released her, stepping back with visible effort, though his eyes lingered on her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. "We should have shored that section before pushing further," he said, more to himself than to her, raking a hand through his dark hair. "I misjudged it. I'm sorry, Miss Hayes. That's twice now this mountain has nearly taken someone I couldn't bear to lose." The words slipped out before he seemed to realize their weight, and Caroline saw the moment he heard himself, saw the flush that rose beneath his beard, the sudden awkward retreat in his posture as though he might take the sentiment back if only he moved fast enough. But Caroline found she did not want him to take it back. "I don't believe you've lost me yet, Mr. Ford," she said softly, "and I don't intend to give you cause to if I can help it." He looked at her a long moment, something unguarded and searching in his winter sky eyes before he cleared his throat and turned back toward the mine entrance with brisk purpose. "We'll shore that section proper before we go another foot deeper, and Miss Hayes, Caroline," she said, "I think after that you might call me Caroline." A faint smile tugged at his mouth, quickly hidden but not quickly enough. "Caroline, then. And you may as well call me Tobias, if we're to keep nearly dying together with any regularity." That evening, after they had shored the collapsed section, and Caroline had returned to Silver Bend trembling with exhaustion, and something warmer she did not yet have a name for, she found Mabel Sutton waiting up for her with a plate of stew kept warm on the stove. "You've a look about you," Mabel observed, setting the plate before her. "Something happened up on that mountain today, and I'd wager it wasn't only rock falling." Caroline flushed despite herself. "The tunnel gave way. Tobias pulled me clear before it could bury us both." "Tobias, is it now?" Mabel said, arching an eyebrow with obvious satisfaction. "Well, I did wonder how long it would take that man to let someone close enough to use his given name. He's kept himself so shut up on that mountain these 7 years, I'd near given up hope he'd ever let another soul in. He blames himself terribly for what happened to Dutch Albrecht," Caroline said quietly. "I don't think he's forgiven himself, not truly, even now." Mabel's expression softened with old sympathy. "No, I don't suppose he has. Grief like that has a way of digging in deep, same as any vein of ore, and just as hard to root out once it's settled. But you've done something already, dear, whether you know it or not. I've not seen that man ride into town willingly in years, and here he is doing it near daily now, all for the sake of your grandfather's mine." "For the sake of my grandfather," Caroline corrected, though even as she said it, she wondered if that were entirely true anymore. It was not many days later that the peace of their growing partnership was disrupted by an unwelcome visitor. Caroline had just finished a morning's work hauling debris when a well-dressed stranger appeared at the mine entrance astride a fine bay horse, his suit too clean for mountain travel, his manner too smooth for honest business. He introduced himself as Jacob Ridley, representing the Continental Mining Syndicate out of Denver, and his smile carried the particular oiliness of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through means other than honest labor. "Miss Hayes, I presume," he said, dismounting with theatrical ease. "I've come a long way to speak with you about your grandfather's claim." "I wasn't aware the Continental Mining Syndicate had any interest in the Silver Star," Caroline said warily, very aware of Tobias straightening from his work nearby, his eyes narrowing on the stranger with immediate suspicion. "We're always interested in claims with promising history, even ones that have fallen into disrepair," Ridley said smoothly. I understand your grandfather passed without completing the required annual assessment work these past years, given his declining health. Federal mining law requires a certain amount of labor performed on a claim each year to maintain title, Miss Hayes. Without proof of that work, a claim can be declared abandoned and opened for relocation by any party who files first. His smile widened, though it did not reach his eyes. My syndicate would be prepared to offer you a fair sum for the claim, sparing you the trouble and expense of proving up the assessment work yourself, particularly given the mine's rather troubled history. The claim is not for sale, Caroline said flatly. I'd think carefully before refusing, Miss Hayes. Assessment work must be filed and verified by the county recorder before the season closes, or the claim reverts to public domain. And I assure you, my company has men watching the recorder's office rather closely for exactly such an opportunity. It would be a shame to lose everything through simple oversight when a fair offer sits before you. Tobias had moved to stand beside Caroline by now, his considerable size a silent and unmistakable statement. The lady said the claim's not for sale, Ridley. I'd suggest you ride back to Denver and tell your syndicate the same. Ridley's eyes flicked over Tobias with poorly concealed disdain, though he was careful not to let it reach his voice. And you would be. Nobody you need concern yourself with, so long as you keep your distance from this mine and this woman. Something calculating passed behind Ridley's eyes, but he only inclined his head with false courtesy. I'll leave my card with the assay office, Miss Hayes, in case you reconsider. Assessment work must total at least $100 value of labor performed and properly documented before the recorder's deadline, which falls at the end of this season. I do hope, for your sake, that you manage it. He remounted his horse with the same theatrical grace and rode off down the mountain trail, leaving behind a silence thick with unspoken threat. He means to have this mine, whatever it costs him, Tobias said grimly, watching the retreating figure. Men like that don't ride 2 days into the mountains over idle curiosity. How much time do we have before this deadline he spoke of? Caroline asked, dread pooling cold in her stomach. Tobias considered, doing some private calculation. The assessment year for most claims closes near the end of September. That gives us perhaps 10 weeks if he's told the truth about the timing, though men like Ridley rarely tell the whole truth about anything. He looked at her, and something fierce and protective had settled into his expression, a resolve that had not been there before. We'll need to move faster than I'd planned, and we'll need proof of every hour's labor, witnessed and documented, so no syndicate lawyer can claim otherwise. I know the recorder in town, old Whitfield. He's an honest man, whatever else Silver Bend lacks. We'll bring him up to witness the work himself, more than once, so there's no question raised later. Thank you, Caroline said softly, for standing with me against him. Tobias's jaw tightened, though his eyes had gone gentle. I gave my word to your grandfather in a manner of speaking the day you rode up my mountain. I don't intend to break it now, not for the likes of Jacob Ridley. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of exhausting, exhilarating labor. Word of Ridley's visit had spread through Silver Bend, and to Caroline's surprise, several townsfolk who had initially dismissed her venture as foolish now offered what help they could, driven by a collective dislike of outside syndicates swooping in to claim what locals had bled for. A young man named Petey Larkin, barely 18 and eager for wages, joined their labor for a modest daily rate. Old Whitfield himself climbed the mountain twice to witness and formally document the assessment work being performed. His careful ledger entries a bulwark against any future legal challenge. And through it all, Caroline and Tobias worked side by side, their partnership deepening into something neither of them named aloud, but which grew undeniable with each passing day. She learned the particular quiet concentration that came over him when he judged the soundness of rock, the way his hands, so capable of splitting logs with brutal efficiency, could also be extraordinarily gentle when steadying a beam she struggled to hold in place. his fingers brushing hers with a warmth that lingered long after the contact ended. He learned, in turn, her stubborn refusal to quit even when exhaustion left her hands blistered and her back aching, the way she hummed old hymns under her breath when the work grew monotonous, the fierce intelligence with which she pored over her grandfather's map each evening, searching for patterns Tobias himself had missed after years in these mountains. One evening, as a summer storm rolled down from the peaks and forced them to shelter in Tobias's cabin rather than risk the trail back to Silver Bend in darkness and rain, Caroline found herself sitting across from him at his rough wooden table, a fire crackling in the stone hearth, rain hammering against the roof in a steady rhythm that felt almost peaceful after weeks of grinding labor. "You've never told me what became of your own family," Caroline said, watching firelight play across his features. "Mabel mentioned you came to Silver Bend as a young man, but never why." Tobias was quiet a long moment, turning a tin cup of coffee slowly between his large hands. "My family had a farm in Missouri before the war. I was young when it started, but old enough to fight by the end of it. Came home to find the farm burned, my father dead of fever. My mother remarried to a man who had no use for a returning soldier with no trade but killing. I drifted west after that, worked cattle for a spell, tried my hand at trapping, and eventually found my way to these mountains and to mining, which suited something restless in me that farm work never had." He glanced up at her. "I never married, if that's the shape of the question you're circling toward, Caroline. Never found reason to, until I'd already decided I was better suited to solitude than to sharing my life with another soul." "And now?" Caroline asked, her heart beating strangely fast in the firelit quiet. Something shifted in his expression, a vulnerability he rarely allowed to surface. "Now I find myself less certain of that conclusion than I once was," he said, his voice low and rough. "You've a way of making a man question decisions he thought long settled, Caroline Hayes." "I don't mean to unsettle anything," she said softly, though her pulse betrayed the lie in her own words, for she very much hoped she was unsettling something. "I know you don't mean to," Tobias said, setting down his cup and rising from his chair to move closer, drawn as though by some force neither of them could name. "You've simply done it regardless." He stopped before her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him even through the space between them. "I've not felt worthy of happiness in 7 years, Caroline. I buried that alongside Dutch Albrecht and told myself I'd earned nothing better than this mountain and my own company for whatever years remained to me. But you've made me wonder if perhaps I judged that sentence too harshly." "You were not to blame for what happened to him," Caroline said, reaching up to rest her hand against his jaw, feeling the rough texture of his beard, the tension held tight in his powerful frame. "I've watched you these past weeks, Tobias. I've seen how carefully you work, how much thought you give to every timber and every beam precisely because you carry that grief with you still. You are not a careless man. You never were. Dutch Albrecht's death was a tragedy, not a judgment on your worth." His hand rose to cover hers where it rested against his face, and she felt it tremble slightly. This man of such overwhelming strength undone by simple tenderness. "You cannot know how much I needed to hear that spoken aloud, by someone whose good opinion I've come to value more than I dared admit." "Then let me say it as many times as you need to believe it," Caroline whispered, and when he lowered his head toward hers, she rose to meet him, and their first kiss was slow and searching, warmed by firelight and 7 years of loneliness finally beginning to thaw. His arms came around her, gentle despite their strength, as though he feared breaking something precious, and she melted against him with a certainty that surprised her with its depth. When at last they parted, both breathing unsteadily, he rested his forehead against hers. "I did not intend for this to happen," he murmured, though there was no regret in his tone, only wonder. "Neither did I," Caroline admitted, "though I find I am not sorry for it." "Nor am I," Tobias said, and drew her close again, holding her against his chest as the storm raged outside and the fire burned low, both of them content, for the first time in longer than either cared to measure, simply to exist in the warmth of another's presence. The rain kept them at the cabin through the night, though propriety demanded, and Tobias insisted, despite Caroline's soft protests, that she take his bed while he slept before the hearth wrapped in a bearskin, a gentleman's concession that made her smile even as some small, honest part of her wished he had not been quite so gallant. By morning the storm had passed, leaving the mountain washed clean and glittering beneath a fresh sun, and they rode down to Silver Bend together in a silence that felt entirely different from any silence that had passed between them before, charged now with unspoken understanding and the promise of what was still to come. Their growing affection did not go unnoticed in Silver Bend, and if anything, it seemed to hearten the townsfolk further in their support of Caroline's claim, as though the sight of their reclusive mountain man finally rejoining the world of the living, and doing so for love, gave the whole venture a fairy tale quality that appealed to hardened miners and weathered wives alike. Mabel Sutton took considerable satisfaction in the development, and made no secret of her approval each time Caroline returned to the boarding house with color in her cheeks that had nothing to do with mountain wind. But the specter of Jacob Ridley had not vanished simply because they had rebuffed him once, and it was on a warm afternoon in late July, some 6 weeks into their labor, and with the assessment deadline drawing steadily nearer, that the true danger of his intentions revealed itself. Caroline and Tobias had pushed the excavation nearly to the point marked on Silas Hayes's map as the new drift, working now with Petey Larkin's help to clear the last stubborn barrier of rockfall that had sealed the passage since her grandfather's final visit years before. It was grueling, careful work, testing each section for foul air with a caged canary Tobias had purchased specifically for the purpose, checking every beam twice before trusting their weight beneath it. They had made camp near the entrance rather than ride the mountain trail each day, a simple lean-to shelter and a fire ring that had become, in its own way, as familiar to Caroline now as her childhood home. It was well past midnight. The fire burned down to embers, when the sound of horses' hooves on the trail below jerked Tobias awake, with the instinct of a man long accustomed to danger in wild places. He was on his feet with his rifle in hand before Caroline had even fully roused, and Petey, sleeping nearby, startled awake at the sharp motion. "Someone's coming," Tobias said quietly, moving to douse what remained of the fire's glow. "Stay behind me, both of you." 3 riders emerged from the tree line, and even in the dim starlight Caroline recognized the lead figure's bearing before she saw his face clearly. Jacob Ridley had not come alone this time, and the 2 men flanking him carried themselves with the unmistakable readiness of hired muscle rather than businessmen. "Mr. Ford," Ridley said, his earlier smoothness now edged with something harder. "I'd hoped we might resolve this matter without further unpleasantness, but it seems Miss Hayes remains stubbornly attached to a worthless hole in the ground." "You've no business on this claim after dark, Ridley," Tobias said, his rifle steady in hands that showed no tremor despite the danger. "I'd suggest you and your men turn around before this goes somewhere none of us want it to." "I've come to make one final, generous offer," Ridley continued, as though Tobias hadn't spoken. $500, Miss Hayes, for a claim my own surveyors tell me is likely worthless. Consider it charity, if you like, for a woman clearly out of her depth. Refuse, and I promise you, one way or another, my syndicate will see this claim declared abandoned before your precious assessment deadline arrives. There are more ways to delay a recorder's filing than you might imagine, and considerably fewer scruples in Denver boardrooms than you'd hope. "Get off this mountain," Caroline said, stepping forward despite Tobias's low protest, her voice steadier than she felt. "I don't know what you imagine you'll accomplish by threatening us in the dark like common outlaws, Mr. Ridley, but I assure you, Mr. Whitfield has already documented every hour of labor performed on this claim, witnessed and notarized. Whatever schemes your syndicate imagines, You will find this claim considerably better defended than you anticipated." Something ugly flickered across Ridley's face at the challenge, and one of his men shifted his hand toward the pistol at his hip, a movement Tobias caught instantly, his own rifle swinging to track the motion with lethal precision. "I'd think very carefully before that hand finishes what it started," Tobias said, his voice gone cold and flat in a way Caroline had not heard from him before, a warning drawn from whatever hard experience the war and the mountains had taught him. "I've killed men for less reason than defending what's mine, and I'll not hesitate to do so again tonight if you force the matter." The threat hung in the night air, and for a long, breathless moment no one moved. Then Ridley, apparently deciding the odds did not favor pressing further in darkness against an armed man who showed no fear, forced a thin smile and gathered his reins. "You've made your position clear enough, Mr. Ford. I'll simply have to pursue other avenues. Good evening, Miss Hayes. I do hope you'll not come to regret this stubbornness." The three riders vanished back down the mountain trail, leaving Caroline trembling with adrenaline once the danger had passed, Tobias's arm coming around her shoulders immediately, steady and warm. "He'll not give up so easily," Tobias said grimly, watching the darkness where the riders had disappeared. "Men like that measure their worth by what they can seize, and he's invested too much pride now to walk away without a fight." "What did he mean about other avenues?" Caroline asked, unease coiling tight in her chest. "I don't know," Tobias admitted, "but we'd best finish this work faster than I'd hoped, and get that assessment properly filed before he finds whatever crooked path he means to try next." Petey, who had watched the entire confrontation with wide eyes, finally found his voice. "Should we tell the sheriff, Mr. Ford? Silver Bend's sheriff is an honest enough man, but he's one man with no deputies and no jurisdiction over whatever schemes Ridley cooks up in a Denver boardroom," Tobias said. "Our best defense is finishing this excavation, documenting every hour properly, and getting that filing recorded before his deadline games can take effect. We work faster from here, and we work smarter." They redoubled their efforts in the days that followed, pushing through the final barrier of rockfall with an urgency that left all three of them exhausted by each day's end. Though Caroline found she had never felt more alive, more certain of purpose, than in those grueling weeks of labor, alongside the man she had come to love with a suddenness that still occasionally startled her when she paused to consider it. It was on a bright morning in early August, as they finally broke through the last section of rubble into the new drift her grandfather had marked on his map before his hands grew too weak to keep digging, that they discovered what Silas Hayes had spent his final strength uncovering. The passage opened into a chamber that widened beyond the reach of their lamplight, and Tobias, ever cautious, insisted on testing the air thoroughly before allowing Caroline further inside. The canary sang undisturbed in its cage, and satisfied the passage held no hidden gas. He led her forward with lamp held high, illuminating walls that shimmered with a richness neither of them had quite dared to hope for. "Silver," Caroline breathed, running her fingers along a vein that ran thick and unbroken along the chamber wall, glinting silver-white in the lamplight. "Tobias, is this truly?" "That's high-grade ore, Caroline," Tobias said, his own voice hushed with something like awe as he examined the vein more closely, breaking off a small sample with practiced ease. "Better than anything I ever saw in this mountain during all my years working it. Your grandfather was right. He found something worth every risk he took to reach it." Caroline felt tears rise unbidden as she pressed her palm against the cool rock, imagining her grandfather here in this very chamber, alone with failing strength, discovering at last the reward for decades of stubborn faith. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew this was here, and he wanted me to have it, even though he never lived to see it properly claimed." "He gave you more than silver, Caroline," Tobias said gently, drawing her against his side. "He gave you the chance to finish what he started, and he trusted you'd find the courage to see it through. Which you have, more thoroughly than I think even he imagined." They spent the following days documenting the find thoroughly, with old Whitfield climbing the mountain once more to witness the discovery firsthand and record it properly for the county recorder, ensuring no question could later arise about the legitimacy of the claim or the assessment work performed to secure it. Word inevitably spread through Silver Bend, as such news always did in small mining towns, and the discovery of a rich new vein in the long-abandoned Silver Star mine became the talk of every saloon and boarding house within days. It was this very publicity that forced Jacob Ridley's hand rather more quickly than he might have preferred, and forced the confrontation that would finally settle the matter of the claim once and for all. Caroline and Tobias rode into Silver Bend together on a September morning to file the final assessment paperwork with Whitfield at the recorder's office, only to find Ridley already there, engaged in a heated argument with the elderly recorder over some technicality he seemed determined to invent from whole cloth. "I'm telling you, Whitfield, the filing deadline for that claim expired at the start of this month," Ridley was insisting as they entered, his composure considerably more frayed than during their previous encounters. "My syndicate has already filed a competing claim on the same ground, and I demand you record it as the valid title. The deadline is the last day of September, same as it's always been, Mr. Ridley," Whitfield replied with the weary patience of a man who had dealt with claim disputes for 30 years and recognized a swindle when he saw one forming before his eyes. "And Miss Hayes's assessment work has been properly documented and witnessed by myself personally on no fewer than 4 separate occasions. I've the ledger entries right here, dated and signed. I'll not falsify county records for any Denver syndicate, however deep their pockets." "Then perhaps you'd care to explain," Ridley said, his voice rising with obvious frustration as he noticed Caroline and Tobias entering, "how a claim that sat abandoned and dangerous for 7 years suddenly produces a rich silver strike the very same season a syndicate expresses interest in acquiring it. It strains credulity, Whitfield, and I intend to contest this filing through every legal channel available to me." "You're welcome to contest it, Ridley," Tobias said, stepping forward with the same cold steadiness he'd shown on the mountain, "but you'll find the law considerably less forgiving of manufactured claims than of honest labor properly documented. I've heard tell, in fact, that your syndicate's competing filing bears a suspiciously recent date, one that happens to fall after we broke through to the new drift and found that vein. A judge might find that timing rather too convenient to overlook." Ridley's face went through several shades of red before he mastered himself enough to speak. "You cannot prove any such thing." "Perhaps not," Tobias said evenly, "but I'd wager Mr. Whitfield here could send a rather detailed letter to the Territorial Land Office describing the sequence of events, along with sworn statements from myself, from young Petey Larkin, and from half of Silver Bend who watched Miss Hayes labor honestly on this claim for months before your syndicate ever showed interest. I imagine that would raise considerably more questions about your competing filing than about hers." Whitfield, clearly enjoying the moment more than his professional decorum strictly allowed, nodded gravely. "I'd be happy to compose exactly such a letter, given the circumstances. Fraudulent claim filings are a serious matter under territorial law, Mr. Ridley, and I don't imagine your syndicate's board of directors would look kindly on the scandal of having one of their agents exposed for attempting exactly that." Ridley looked between them, calculating and finding, at last, no path forward that did not end in his own considerable embarrassment. "This is not finished," he said stiffly, though the threat carried none of its earlier force. "But I've no wish to waste further time on a claim this troublesome." He gathered whatever remained of his dignity and stalked from the office, and though Caroline half expected further trouble from him, no word of the Continental Mining Syndicate ever troubled Silver Bend again. Whitfield later mentioned hearing, through the usual channels of gossip that traveled between territorial offices, that Ridley had been quietly dismissed from his position not long after, his superiors having grown weary of his failed schemes and the scandal his methods had nearly caused. With the assessment work properly filed and witnessed well before the September deadline, and the claim's legitimacy beyond any legal challenge, Caroline Hayes found herself, at last, the undisputed owner of a mine that had transformed from her grandfather's abandoned dream into a genuinely valuable enterprise. But it was not the silver that occupied her thoughts most fully in the weeks that followed, so much as the man who had made its safe claiming possible, and whose presence had become as essential to her happiness as breath itself. It was on a golden evening in early October, the aspens along the mountainside blazing gold against the darkening green of the pines, that Tobias led Caroline up a familiar trail, not toward the mine this time, but to a rocky overlook above his cabin where the whole valley spread below them in the fading light, Silver Bend's rooftops catching the last sun, the mountains beyond folding into purple shadow. "I brought you here for a reason," Tobias said, his usual steady composure betraying a nervousness Caroline had rarely witnessed in him, not even in the face of Ridley's armed men. "I rather suspected as much," Caroline said softly, watching him with a tenderness that had only deepened in the months since their first meeting. He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his much larger ones, his winter sky eyes intent on her face. "Caroline, when you rode up my mountain that first day, I was a man who had convinced himself he deserved nothing but solitude, that whatever happiness I might once have hoped for had been buried alongside Dutch Albrecht 7 years past. I did not expect, and did not think I wanted, anyone to challenge that conviction. But you did, from the very first moment, with nothing more than your stubbornness and your grief and your absolute refusal to accept my refusals." He drew a breath, and she felt his hands tremble slightly around hers. "I love you, Caroline Hayes. I love you more than I ever imagined possible for a man who had given up on love entirely. I don't have much to offer you beyond this mountain, my cabin, and whatever strength these hands can provide, but I would be the happiest man in the territory if you'd consent to be my wife." Caroline felt tears rise, warm and unstoppable, as she looked into the face of the man who had transformed both her inheritance and her heart. "Tobias Ford, I came to this mountain seeking only my grandfather's mine, and I found instead the truest, gentlest, strongest man I have ever known. You made it safe for me to enter that mine, yes, but you also made it safe for me to love again, to trust again, after so much loss. I love you with everything I am, and there is nothing in this world I want more than to be your wife." He kissed her then, beneath the blazing gold aspens with the whole valley spread golden and glorious below them, and when at last they parted, both laughing with the sheer joy of it, he pulled a small object from his pocket, a simple silver ring, its band etched with a delicate pattern of pine boughs. "I made this myself," he admitted, slightly abashed, "from a piece of that first ore sample we pulled from your grandfather's drift. I know it's not the sort of ring a lady from St. Louis might expect, but I wanted you to have something made from the very silver that brought us together. It is more precious to me than any ring from any St. Louis jeweler could ever be," Caroline said, extending her hand so he could slip it onto her finger, the metal still bearing the faint warmth of his own hands where he had worked it. "It carries our whole story in it, Tobias. Grandfather's dream, your patience and courage, and everything we found together in that mountain." They were married 3 weeks later in Silver Bend's small clapboard church, with Mabel Sutton weeping happy tears throughout the ceremony, old Whitfield serving as witness to a far happier document than any mining claim, and Petey Larkin, grinning ear to ear, tasked with holding the rings until the appointed moment. The whole town turned out for the wedding and the celebration that followed, for in the months since Caroline's arrival, she had become as much a fixture of Silver Bend as any long-time resident, and the sight of their reclusive mountain man finally claimed by love, as thoroughly as he had once claimed the safety of that dangerous mine, filled the town with a collective warmth that lasted long into the celebration. The Silver Star Mine, worked now under proper safety measures that Tobias insisted upon with the same rigor he had shown throughout its restoration, became one of the most productive claims in the district within 2 years, providing steady employment for a growing number of Silver Bend's residents, and ensuring that Caroline and Tobias never again wanted for security or comfort. Caroline insisted the mine's profits fund improvements to the town itself, a proper schoolhouse and an expanded church, gestures that endeared her further to a community that had watched her arrive as a stranger and stayed to become one of their most beloved residents. Tobias, for his part, found in the mine's careful operation a means of finally laying to rest the guilt that had haunted him for 7 long years. He oversaw every aspect of its safety personally, training the miners he employed in the same careful methods he had used to reclaim the Silver Star. And in time, the memory of Dutch Albrecht's death transformed from a wound he carried alone into a lesson he taught others, ensuring no other family would suffer such a loss under his watch. He wrote, at last, a proper letter to Dutch's widow in Denver, explaining fully what had happened and what had come of it since, and received in return a gracious reply that eased something in his heart that had remained tender for far too long. Their first child, a son they named Silas after the grandfather whose stubborn faith had brought them together, was born in the autumn of 1886, a robust, dark-haired boy who Tobias declared from his very first cry possessed his mother's fierce determination, and Caroline insisted with equal certainty, his father's steady calm. 2 years later, a daughter followed, whom they named Dorothy Mabel, in honor of the boarding house keeper who had shown Caroline such kindness on her very first day in Silver Bend, and who wept with joy upon learning of the tribute. 3 more children followed across the years that came after, filling the log home Tobias expanded from his original cabin with laughter and noise that would once have seemed impossible to imagine in a place that had known only solitary silence for so long. Caroline often climbed in the years that followed to that same rocky overlook where Tobias had first proposed, sometimes alone, sometimes with her husband's arm around her shoulders, sometimes trailed by a small procession of children eager to see the valley their parents so loved. She would look down at Silver Bend, grown now into a proper town with its schoolhouse and its church and its thriving mine, and remember the frightened, grieving young woman who had stepped off a dusty stagecoach with nothing but a deed and a map and a promise to a dying man. She had come seeking only an inheritance, uncertain even of its worth, and had found instead a life richer than any vein of silver could measure, built alongside a man whose strength had made the mountain safe for her, and whose gentle, patient love had made her heart safe for him in return. Tobias, for his part, never tired of telling their children the story of how their mother had ridden a stubborn mule up his mountain, and refused every reason he'd given her to turn back, how she had stood on his porch with dirt on her dress and fire in her eyes, and changed the entire course of a life he had thought settled into permanent solitude. He told it differently each time, embellishing some small detail or another, but the heart of it never changed. That love, like silver, sometimes lay buried deep beneath layers of grief and fear, waiting only for someone brave enough and patient enough to dig until they found it. And on quiet evenings, when the children had been put to bed and the fire burned low in the hearth of the home they had built together, Caroline would rest her head against her husband's broad chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and think that whatever her grandfather had hoped to leave her when he penned that final letter, he could never have imagined the truest treasure the Silver Star Mine would ultimately yield. Not silver, though there was plenty of that too, but a love so deep and so certain that it had transformed a mountain of grief into a home filled with joy, and made 2 wounded, wandering hearts finally, completely safe.